Great, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to see everybody here. Good morning, I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this side event, to the 2024 Protection of Civilians Week, 25 years of POC and the UN Security Council, challenges and opportunities. We'll try to keep the balance, but the challenges seem to be quite high these days. Many thanks to the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations, our co-host today, in partnership with the Permanent Missions of the Republic of Mozambique and the United Kingdom, as well as the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC. Thank you to all. This year, as you all are no doubt aware, marks 25 years since the Security Council first recognized the protection of civilians as a matter of international peace and security. The Council held its first open debate on POC on February 12th, 1999, noting that, quote, civilians now account for the vast majority of casualties in armed conflict and are increasingly directly targeted by combatants and armed elements. Stemming from this 1999 debate, the Council requested the Secretary General to begin regular reporting on the protection of civilians. And later that year, the Council issued the first explicit mandate for a UN peacekeeping operation to protect civilians in Sierra Leone, UNAMSL. Ever since, UNAMSL has served as a template for subsequent POC mandates, which are now a bedrock of UN peacekeeping. As has been noted by the Secretary General, POC has become the yardstick by which mission performance is measured. Over the past 25 years, the Council has also issued many thematic resolutions related to POC, and I understand another one is in the works, including condemning attacks on journalists, humanitarian personnel, healthcare workers, and civilian infrastructure, and more. Overall, the norm of protection has become deeply embedded, not only within Security Council mandates or UN peacekeeping operations, but throughout the entire UN system. Just this past March, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights issued the long-awaited UN Agenda for Protection, noting that protection puts people and their needs at the center of the work of the United Nations. Protection underpins everything the United Nations does. And yet, 25 years from that first POC mandate, it is difficult to claim enduring success. The hard reality of today's political and security context has left the protection of civilians at grave risks. In contexts like Sudan, Gaza, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, among others, civilians continue to be intentionally targeted by warring parties and are affected by flagrant violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws. These violations have devastating consequences for civilians in conflict settings, but they are also symptoms of a worrying and broader challenge to the normative frameworks that underpin the very stability of the entire international system. And in some cases, the challenge is coming from Council members themselves, who have been directly or indirectly involved in violations. So, what does this all mean? What are the trends? And what is to be done? Small task for our conversation today. We're going to talk about it, and I am really privileged to have this group of panelists to speak with. We're hoping to have this as an interactive conversation. And so the format is I will give each panelist one question to kick off the conversation with a brief 3-minute answer. And then we'll have a discussion with additional questions, followed by a Q&A from the floor, so prepare your questions yourselves. And then we will turn to closing remarks from Her Excellency Pascal Barsuel, Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the United Nations, who I should say I'm really grateful to have here because I'm sure there is a lot to be talked about at the Security Council this morning. It's been quite a busy 24 hours. So we have with us, briefly, you have should have bios and handouts, I believe. We have with us to the left, to right, yes. We have Naz Maduzada, Professor of Practice and Founding Director, Program of International Law and Armed Conflict at the Harvard Law School. Letitia Courtois, Permanent Observer and Head of Delegation, International Committee of the Red Cross. Hichem Kadrawi, Executive Director, Center for Civilians in Conflict, Civic. And Idem Wasornu, Director, Operations and Advocacy Division, United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. We have a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge here. And so I'm going to start with Naz. The question I think that we've discussed that we'd like you to begin with is, if you could tell us a bit about what are the trends we are seeing in the interpretation and legal application of IHL in contemporary conflict contexts, and how do these trends, in your view, pose some rather specific risks to the protection of civilians? Naz, please.
Thank you so much, Adam, for the question, and thank you to the organizers for sponsoring this timely and important forum. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. So I was thinking about this question, and I was thinking back to when I was first becoming an IHL lawyer and an IHL practitioner, and I think one of the fundamental truisms or myths that you are taught when you begin to study IHL and become involved in the field is that IHL can never be so demanding or exacting that it impedes the ability of militaries to wage and win wars. In a sense, you are trained that any legitimate or acceptable interpretation of the law must always take into account that if the law is interpreted in a manner that is overly restrictive, the law would collapse. This embodies, in my view, both a promise and a threat. The promise is that there will be some law in war, and the threat is that if you ask for too much protection, you will ultimately get no protection whatsoever. It is with this mentality that I think many IHL experts have experienced the last 7 months. For many of us, I think this period has been characterized almost by a kind of split screen. On the one side are unbearable, truly unbearable images of death, destruction, and suffering, as well as for many in this room in particular, messages from friends and colleagues of a human crisis of a speed and scale rarely witnessed by even the most hardened and experienced humanitarian colleagues. On the other side of the screen have been scenes where spokespeople for many governments are seemingly unable to string together a simple sentence answering the basic question of whether any IHL violations are being committed by the party they are supporting. For those of us fortunate not to be directly experiencing conflict, we have a jarring feeling of moving between our fundamental moral reactions and a refrain that it is impossible for some governments and experts to draw any conclusions about legality. A number of military leaders and experts adjacent to certain militaries have insisted that the solution to this sense of fragmentation is to simply explain to us that we are misguided. According to this view, many of our moral intuitions are both incorrect and irrelevant. They are incorrect in the sense that the dominant military interpretation of IHL justifies mass killing and destruction. And they are irrelevant in the sense that the dominant interpretation of IHL cannot be properly comprehended by those of us outside the armed forces. Those leaders and lawyers can articulate these positions in front of the world because of an approach to IHL that has long preceded the current war and that has far-reaching ramifications beyond the death and destruction that is currently being rained upon Gaza and communities in other armed conflicts. This is an interpretation of IHL applicable to the conduct of hostilities that makes two fundamental assertions. First, that the interpretation of the rules is extremely flexible and must be decided behind closed doors. And second, that the implementation of those interpretations is not and must not be susceptible to external scrutiny. For as long as I've been an IHL lawyer, I have taken both the threat and the promise very seriously. And I feel like my sense today is that the promise has never been enough and that the threat must be challenged head on. I look forward to the conversation.
I want to turn right to the issue, but I can't help but ask one quick. This fragmentation and the division between the promise and in terms of the trend, you said it predates this war. But is the trend that this is widening? This is not just something a position that the militaries have had for a long time. Is it widening?
I think so, and I think also just we all know that the amount of attention we pay to different wars is not fair, right? It's not equally distributed. But I think that the global public reaction that we are seeing to the war at Gaza specifically it's undeniable, and it is really illuminating that fragmentation that I think does precede this war, but I think is increasingly becoming untenable.
Yeah, great, excellent. Thank you. Much more to come on that on this point, I suspect. Wonderful. So, Leticia, we are talking about opportunities and some of the successes over the last 25 years as well, not just the current context. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit from your view, what have been some of the normative achievements concerning the Council's commitment to POC over the last 25 years? And then really given today's geopolitical landscape, what prospects are there for sustaining the commitment to POC and to IHL and more broadly related to the Council?
Thank you very much, Adam. Good morning, everyone. It's true, the POC agenda, the Security Council, is definitely a dynamic field. We count not less than at least a dozen resolutions that specifically have been adopted since 1999. And some of them we contributed as many humanitarian practitioners as well to bring that reality to the Council members' attention. And that translated into resolutions focusing on specifically vulnerable groups of civilians, or also on thematics that were reverberating more acutely, as well as conflicts were expanding or developing. Just a few mentions, starting with 2286, the protection of medical mission, adopted in 2016, was remarkable, but also the resolution 2417 on food security, flagging that starvation as a method of warfare is a crime. Resolution around the issue of missing and protection of those going missing, including detainees, which is something that we particularly care about, 2474, and a few others, such as the 2475 on the protection of disabilities in conflict, as well as the latest 2573 on protection of essential infrastructures. It's definitely not just that. I think POC is a discussion that takes place weekly at the Security Council through adoption of statements, through discussion around context-specific thematic briefs. And I think this is also something that shows how the commitment of the Council is on this particular issue. There's a willingness to understand better the deeper impact of conflict, how it affects civilians, and how IHL can and should protect better. I think it's also interesting to see that, unfortunately, as texts are adopted, the reality on the ground cannot be far away from those ideals. And this is really what we see, that unfortunately the implementation on ground is lacking. And while it creates the capacity to raise attention to those dangerous practices, to the improvement of some states, sometimes it happens, we see changes. We also see that there's a problem really in terms of bringing that to the improvement of protection of civilians concretely. We don't just, what Naz mentioned is important. We see as a challenge, of course, the growing elasticity in the interpretation of IHL. For us, it's important to see that everyone agrees to the ideal of IHL, but when it comes to implementation, there's a tendency to adapt everyone's reading to its own objective, which is not necessarily the protection of civilian and reduction of suffering on the ground. In particular, the issue around the conduct of hostilities language could be and should be improved. One very concrete element is that prevention and precaution can be taken before the conflict in a preventive way, with trying to bring constant care to civilian and civilian objects. Those are elements very clearly stated in protection in IHL treaties, Article 57 of the additional protocol number 1, and customary law as well is very clear on this, to try to reduce this harm constantly and not during the peak of the hostilities. We have a lot of elements that show as well that POC discussion and text are somehow one step behind the realities of what we see on the ground. Today, what we see on the field, Gaza, but everywhere else, it's urban warfare related issues. It's the cyber aspects of conflict. We're not just talking about conflict in a kinetic field. There are much more layers that are not outside of the law. The normalization of the suffering of civilians is a very blatant issue that is really showing how also there's a transactional aspect as well to the protection elements and the assistance to civilians. And then with the risk of rising conflict, when in 1919, we briefed the council during this first debate, we mentioned with concern that we were faced with 20 conflicts. Today, when we talk of about 120 conflicts, we might just wonder if this is some reality that should also be tackled by addressing those long-term conflicts that keep repeating in the same areas and bring to a downward cycle because there's no long-term solution. And therefore, that long-term solution will be a solution to the protection of civilians. We also have a large interpretation of possible action as well by parties and their alliances, supporters, supply chain of weapons. Those discussions are often brought in the Security Council, but in a very contextualized way, and therefore does not allow to address the issue in a less heated debate. And this is really an issue that we will encourage to be addressed more forcefully. I think I'll stop here because there's a number of challenges. We could go on and on, but maybe just in terms of opportunities, we need to build on adapted resolutions. Those are important texts. IHL is constantly being reminded, quoted. There's no denial of its importance, but we need this to be consistently and faithfully interpreted as well. We need to bring also and connect those discussions in the Council with discussion that take place outside of the Security Council that also bring those thematics such as urban warfare. There's the very interesting leading example of the Declaration on Explosive Weapons in Populated Area, known as EWIPA, that brings also a lot of very concrete elements that could also acknowledge and tackle the gravity of the issue. And of course, everyone has in mind the Summit of the Future, where we could also inject those elements of peace and stability within the long-term objective of this pact to be adopted in September.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for ending with a little bit of a positive note, looking to the future. But I mean, you note a number of the developments, positive developments over the last 25 years, the resolutions and such. But the question is always implementation. And I think we see that in a number of files. But I think part of the challenge is the changing nature of conflict, and it's really difficult, even more difficult to implement in the context of urban warfare, as you note. And this point, you and I have actually discussed this previously about the growing elasticity in the interpretation of IHL, and it just connected in my mind a bit this point that I found as maybe naively surprising. This point that for militaries they say our interpretation of IHL can't be susceptible to outside scrutiny. And if the elasticity of the interpretation is widening, and the militaries are pushing back saying this cannot be subject to external scrutiny, what is to be done, and what is the role of the Security Council there in that context? And then of course, the realities on the ground become much more grave for civilians. And so we're going to turn to Civic and that specific question. And so, I mean, Letitia mentioned urban warfare, cyber, and so we wanted to ask you, Hisham, how has the changing nature of conflict increased the threat posed to civilians in conflict contexts? And as a result, are there actually changes needed in some of the normative and legal frameworks to better ensure the protection of civilians? Hisham, please.
Thank you very much. And I want really to thank IPI and all the partners for this event. I start the POC week with this particular topic today, and I think it's extremely important. And I would like that this POC week is under the sign of accountability and responsibility that will lead to the increase of chances for implementation. So the changing nature of conflicts. I will distinguish 4 elements where I will see conflicts, let's say, change in its nature and evolve, not in a good way, unfortunately. First and foremost, the protracted nature of conflicts. I mean, ICRC has the very good statistic that is really valid right now. I mean, we see an increase in the length of the conflicts, the way they stay. When a conflict starts, it's extremely hard to even know when it will stop. And some people today, and I talk about the Ukraine-Russia war, some people will say, why it should stop? Because I want justice for my country or justice for my country. So there's not even the question of stopping a conflict today. And this is extremely consequential for civilians at 2 levels. First of all, protracted conflicts means extended negative consequences on civilians' lives and on the infrastructures. They are not repaired, there is no economy. So basically, if you don't have water today, for the next 20 years, you don't have access to healthy water, you don't have schools running, people are scared even to go and do their shopping. So the protracted nature has a direct and immediate impact, short-term and long-term, on civilians. The second criteria for me is the type of weapons that are being used today and the way we use them. It seems like we are completely free from any mental barriers or psychological barriers. We can use whatever we have, basically. So I go on Amazon or AliExpress and I buy 20 drones and I send them. And it's very easy. So now we are using cheap drones, ballistic missiles, 1-ton bombs on infrastructures. I mean, 1-ton bombs. I mean, I spent 10 years of my life in conflict zones. I can tell you a 1-ton bomb is insanely horrendous. And this is on a daily basis. We have armed actors shooting to ships in the Bab el-Mandeb area for them to block. Then, of course, the reaction comes. So we have the type of weapons that are being used, AI-enabled weapons, blind weapons, heavy artillery from the early 20th century. And this has, of course, a direct consequence on civilians. It creates a sense of constant fear. There is no place safe. Today, civilians, when they're in a conflict, there are no place safe. And for those, or all of us who are in conflict zones, you always have pockets of safety. Today, it's impossible. Wherever you go, you will be hit. And I think this is something that is extremely worrying. And I link to that the very lucrative business of arms selling. Now, countries are extremely proud because business is a bit difficult post-COVID, but the weapon selling is pretty good. Last year, 2.4 trillion US dollars were basically made based off the weapon business. And and states are proud about it. You know, it's good. It's like a marketing thing. And of course, the consequences, arms, when they are sold, is not to be put in the garage and look at them. It's to use them at some point. So it will have a direct consequence on populations. And the third one is the direct targeting, something that Naz and Letitia spoke about. It became a goal. Oh, it's okay, you can target them, it's fine. They are here, and why the civilians are there anyway? If they are here, they are supporters of Hamas, they are supporters of Ukraine, of Russia, or RSF, or whatever. And this is a big issue. The direct targeting of civilians becomes the norm and not the exception. And I will add to that the lack of access to basic services. The changing nature of conflicts brought the consequence where today humanitarian actors have extreme difficulty to carry out their basic duty. We have 190 UN staff got killed in Gaza. The last one, it was only last week. We have a difficulty to access basic services, just like food. So this as well, it's a constant issue, and civilians, of course, bear the brunt of it. And the fourth one is the weaponization of information that becomes a tool of war. It has a psychological consequence, psychological warfare. So if you add the physical consequence, the constant bombings, the lack of access to basic services, and plus the constant disinformation used as let's say, a weapon of war, then you understand how the threat against civilians is increased in today's conflicts. To answer the second question, are changes needed in normative and legal frameworks? If you can't fix your window, don't blame it on your tools. I mean, frameworks are here, they exist, they are being reviewed. I don't believe that we need to change that. It will be too easy. I believe that there is a lack of political will that is leading to a sense of urgency. The lack of political will for me is the first blockage and challenge when it comes to implementation. However, I will still add a point, and not in the elasticity of IHL that Laetitia, of course, mentioned, but IHL today and normative frameworks should be more contextualized, more inclusive, more localized. I think they are seen as a foreign body, but by a lot of communities. I spoke to many armed groups in my life as part of my job, not personally, I will assure you. And what they tell me, and the communities, IHL for them, this is something from Geneva, from New York, people in suits talking about, I have no clue, and it does not, let's say, link to me. So I think we should think about a way of contextualizing IHL, bringing it back to where it belongs, to the people. So there is an effort from all of us to make it more, let's say, easy to understand, to adapting to what is today cultural, religious frameworks. So having more inclusivity, I think, in its implementation, I believe would help. And I will finish that if we do that, we can increase accountability and our own responsibility to have a successful implementation of these frameworks and benefit the civilians directly. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Just on this last point, when you say the contextualization of IHL and helping to educate on the ground what this means in a very particular context, are we talking about trainings for non-state armed groups, also for more lower level military officials, and for specific what is exactly do you mean? Because I mean, also, I think the civilians population is, as I think was mentioned, are the ones right now that are really shedding light on the outrageousness of the current context, right? People have that moral instinct that this is wrong. They don't need to know the ins and outs of the legal interpretation. But maybe that would also help. So
No, it is a very good point. First and foremost, I think we need to make an effort ourselves in adapting the language to the ground. So using religious frameworks, cultural traditions, using what exists already, and make a reference. I give an example, IHL was not created in 1949. The first religious code in the Hindu religion, the Bhagavad Gita, is 4,000 years old. And it has the main elements, the key elements of IHL. And this does not only address to armed groups or just top leaders. For me, it's to everyone who is on the ground, communities, self-protection communities, I think is a top priority. They should be actors of their own change and their own protection. So targeted trainings, targeted, let's say, increased knowledge should be addressing armed groups, military, communities, because they are part of the social fabric of a given conflict. We need to look at it from an exhaustive point of view, not only from just a targeted actor. They are all living together in the same family. In Mali, for example, in the same family. And I saw it, you have one brother working for the military, one brother working for the jihadi groups, and the sister who is leading an NGO to protect women in the same family. So all of those need to understand what is IHL, but from their own point of view, to avoid simple and direct rejection. It's about adherence and building respect of the norms from within the social fabric of a given country.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Excellent. So now we'll turn to OCHA. Adam. We wanted to kind of continue this conversation around the normative frameworks of POC, but also, and OCHA is obviously intimately engaged on the ground. From your view, how can the UN specifically help to better implement these normative frameworks on the ground when it comes to protecting civilians?
Thank you very much, and really happy to be here. A lot has been said, so I'll try not to repeat what's been said, and really grateful to IPI and everyone who's been part of this. POC Week is very dear to my heart. I started in Darfur as OCHA's first legal protection officer under Jan Egeland, because he believed fundamentally that we needed to, at that time, 20 years ago, change the way we did business and some of the things that were happening at the time. To think that Darfur then was a Mickey Mouse compared to Darfur today. And the complete disregard, if I may, of civilian life, and the loss of life. It's just incredible. It's unfathomable. But we need to first acknowledge the achievements of POC and what it's done, the Geneva Conventions at the time when we forget. Let me run you through a few things. UN peacekeeping operations have saved many lives. And here I'm talking from a UN perspective, unmissed POC sites that really saved some 200,000 IDPs in the height of the crisis a few years ago. The work that the missions do, monitoring and reporting on grave violations against children and engagement with parties listed in various Secretary General's CAAC reports, a perspective of listing and delisting under sanctions regimes, arms embargoes, etc. Life would have been much worse without the laws of war and POC and IHL. So taking a moment to appreciate, with its imperfections, it has actually saved a lot of lives. But of course, there's been so much, again, when we talk about loss of life, the protection of civilians and what it means. My fellow panelists have talked about, I like Naz's incorrect and irrelevant accountability. To Hisham's point, Letitia has raised a few points of what the council has been able to do. For me, it's very painful, having been in this business for a while now, to see the complete and disregard of life. And I think Martin Griffiths, our Under-Secretary General, said 4 days ago in Geneva, it's a world which has lost its way, and we need to help find its way back to those norms that we all lived to create. If you look at, from on the 24th of October, last year, I couldn't tweet on UN Day because of the massive and insane loss of life in Gaza. What you've all talked about, what is happening in the world today. It's almost as if the world went crazy after COVID. That civilian lives don't matter. That just killing is okay, and that there is no accountability whatsoever. There's no doubt that many more civilians would have been victims of armed conflict without POC and implementation. I think, Adam, your question about what is the UN going to do, and here I always say to some of the member states, or the member states that I meet in my travels, my missions, the UN is made up of member states. It is a governmental body, and I always say that this UN Secretariat, when I'm briefing the council, it's always, we are the tiny ant. The United Nations is made up of 193 member states. Let's not forget that, but it's not about the UN Secretariat. It's not about the funds and programs. I just wanted to throw that out there. We've blatantly fallen short, though. Let's be clear that the loss of life, if I may, the latest UN recorded figures, 33,443 civilian deaths in armed conflict, a 72% increase since 2022. But of course, everybody's thinking, well, Gaza is an anomaly. Well, it's not. This is not a new trend. 2022 to 2021, the United Nations recorded 16,988, almost 17,000 deaths. a 53% increase from 2021. So we keep seeing loss of life as a normal thing. You see it, you almost become immune to it. When we talk about POC and the implementation, again, back to the issue of member states, it is first and foremost the responsibility of member states. Whether you're talking to a de facto authority, whether you're talking to a government, a fully respected and recognized government, whether you're talking to an armed group, whether you're talking to whoever, as Hisham, you've talked about conversations with armed groups, the state is responsible. And what does that mean? Every time, I remember in one of the countries that I served, one member state said to me, the UN talks about parties to the conflict. It is not a party, we're not a party to the conflict, we're protecting our territory. You say that we have this territorial integrity and sovereignty of a state needs to be respected, and yet you're calling us party to party to a conflict. And we have to explain that you are, whatever you are party to a conflict if you're holding arms against each other in an armed conflict setting or whatever. This is important to me because it's almost a contradiction in itself. We tell a member state, you're giving us a visa, you're securing us, we're here working for the people, but under your umbrella. And at the same time, we're telling them you are party to the conflict. And member states often, host governments often contest us in that way, but we still push back on the fact that it is their responsibility. But I really want to sharpen this point. It is the member states' responsibility. It's not the humanitarians' responsibility or the agencies' funds and programs. Fighting impunity should be a top priority. I mean, we talk about, how can it be better implemented? I worry about the state of the world today, if I may, the number of countries that have turned into what we call in the UN non-family duty stations, even though we started off as a situation where people could take their families. A lot of these countries have turned over the last 2-3 years from family to non-family. This means significant fears of how we can protect our civilians and our aid workers as well. I throw in aid workers because aid workers are also civilians while we're at it. Fighting impunity should be a top priority. Ensuring accountability for serious IHL violations is essential to strengthen the protection of civilians across conflicts. This is super important because, again, without accountability, with open impunity, where is our world going to? And we still continue to insist that POC, IHL should be respected. But colleagues, let me throw something out there on member states who keep telling us over and over again that there should be no color distinction. I think, Naz, you talked about it, for some, and it's more important for some to respect IHL and for others not to. The war in Gaza has changed the face of POC. The war in Gaza has changed the face of IHL. The war in Sudan has changed the face of IHL. The war in Ukraine has changed the face of IHL. But we continue to push it. We continue to push the IHL agenda. We continue to push the POC agenda because the day we stop, what is hope for humanity? POC is not only a compliance issue. Let's put it out there. Member states, parties to conflict also need to start considering POC from a civilian harm perspective, right? We've talked about this before, and I think it was ICRC that it was your president, Leticia, who said something about removing the essence of POC and IHL. It's become almost a shell of itself, and we need to stop making excuses for the lack of respect to IHL and POC. POC is not only a compliance issue. It's not. Member states and parties to conflict also need to start considering POC from a civilian harm perspective and ask themselves not only how do they meet the obligations, but how do they concretely minimize civilian harm? Because right now, again, wherever you go to, as Hisham said, it doesn't matter where you are, you could be a target. I was in Ukraine for 6 days. There were 567 missiles dropped in Ukraine in the 6 days I was there, and some led to the loss of civilian life. No matter how precise these parties to the conflict are trying to be, there's massive destruction of hospitals, not only in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, wherever you turn, there's something missing and there's sort of no accountability, as it were. There's a wealth of good practice to protect civilians in line with various, beyond the law, in line with various Secretary General's reports. We've seen them. We continue to find the best practice out there. As the Secretary General regularly stressed, member states can and should use their influence with parties to conflict to effectively prioritize civilian harm reduction, including through ensuring respect for IHL and withholding arms transfers where there's a clear risk that the arms will be used to commit serious violations of IHL. Your point again, Hisham, about the sale, the massive justifications that member states use and sell arms to others. We know what's happening, and yet there's, I don't want to get into the IWIPA and sale of arms conversation. Colleagues, let me end with 2 points. Without POC, without IHL, the world will be much worse. But without accountability and with the pervasive impunity that is happening, the world is we're all struggling to sell this idea that IHL needs to be respected, that POC, protection of civilians, what does that mean? I really sit here and struggle with the whole POC concept. What does it mean when so many lives are lost every day? I'll stop there, Adam. Thanks.
Thank you. No, incredibly important points, and one must note that this conclusion about accountability is poignant on a day today when everyone read the news about the news from the ICC and the arrest warrants against Hamas and Israel. Incredibly important points. But I just one point that I think is worth reiterating that you made at the start, and that is UN peace operations have saved many lives. I mean, I think there's a lot of discourse right now about the failure of peace operations, but we must recognize that longitudinal studies of the presence of peacekeeping operations and their capacity to protect civilians is quite robust. That's lives have been saved, and we can't forget that. And as a result, we must recognize that as bad as things are, things could be worse if we kind of allow these tools to further deteriorate in some way. And I was struck by Hisham's point that if you can't fix your windows, don't blame the tools. And so, but I want to ask like one general question to the group before we come to the audience, and it's about where we go from here. It is the member states' responsibility. We're all very, very clear on that. And it reminds me, though, of some of the debates around, Letitia, you mentioned Security Council Resolution 2286. And when that came out, there was some concern from some humanitarians of, why do we need another resolution for this? We know member states shouldn't be attacking medical care workers. So we want to remind member states of their responsibility. But if member states are saying, well, yes, we accept this responsibility, but we have this other interpretation of IHL, where does that leave us? And what are some of the legal and tools of accountability that we can pursue in order to advance compliance? One question I think that hasn't exactly come up, but that has been sort of below the surface here, I think, is it comes to some degree around distinctions between civilians and military, both targets and actors. This is not my expertise. This is much more your expertise. But it seems to me, when we're talking about the context that we're in, there's a real blurring line there. Even within the home, you said people, like even one family. Is there a way in which we can both legally and institutionally firm up how that distinction should and would be made? Or is, I think, this point that you make at the end, Idem, about advancing, that it's not just about complying with your understanding of IHL, but taking a very objective look and saying, civilians are dying. And it's not just your obligation to comply with some sort of understanding of IHL, but it is your obligation to ensure that mass civilian casualties don't result from your military strategy. So not just how do you comply, but how do you minimize civilian harm, which seems to me going one step further. Is that a question that makes sense to the group in any way? Wonderful. Would anybody like to jump in on that before we go to the floor?
Sure. I can follow. Yeah, so I think, and building upon the wonderful insights from my co-panelists, it makes me think, so I think your question is, what is to be done if we're all sort of in a way making a pretty bleak observation in a sense about where we are today. So from my narrow and limited perspective, I think I hear more and more in military legal circles the following thing. There are increasingly two IHLs. One is the IHL of the military, the IHL of the practitioners who are applying and operationalizing the law. And the other is the IHL of Geneva, the IHL of the humanitarians, the IHL of the NGOs, right? And the suggestion is one is real, tactical, serious, and the other one, it's in nice offices, right, with humanitarian ideals, but it's not realistic. And one of the things, as someone who sort of moves between humanitarian and military legal circles, that's always struck me is the collective experience of most humanitarians far outstrips in armed conflict the collective experience of many of the military lawyers who are making that observation. So I think the answer to your question in some ways is member states, especially those member states who have expressed the view that they find many of the conflicts that have been described here unacceptable in their civilian toll, whether that is Ukraine or Sudan or Gaza. Now it is their responsibility to stand up for an interpretation of IHL that will take away some of their own flexibility. Right? It is a choice to this idea of the flexibility and the elasticity that we've been talking about. It benefits some and it harms others, right? And so I think we need to be clear that it is in member states' hands, and all of us who play a role in interacting with member states also have an ability to ensure that that perspective is taken into account and that a version, an interpretation of IHL that reflects some of the fundamental moral ideas that we're hearing here is incorporated into how we understand the law.
Will there always be multiple interpretations, or is it possible to come around to uniform standards for the laws of war in this respect?
I think as long as there are lawyers, there are always going to be multiple interpretations, right? So I think then, in a sense, the question is, is there a kind of silent consensus, if you will, amongst those states? Hisham talked about inclusivity. Amongst those states and amongst those publics that have not had a seat at the table in developing IHL, the dominant version of IHL that there is today, if we were to open up those doors, if we were to include more actors in those conversations, would we find that there is a shared view of that interpretation that would emerge as reflecting a value of human life that is not the one that Adem observes happening in the world today? And that is a risk, right? That is a question for how we approach this conversation. But I think, of course, there will always be interpretations. Of course, lawyers will always argue. But what we need, I think, is a sense that this cry for a change that we are hearing from the streets all over the world, from the civilians in these conflicts, has to be answered by concrete changes in the way that this law is both interpreted and, of course, implemented.
Letitia, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just to add to what Nas mentioned, it's very interesting that the Geneva Convention were actually signed by militaries. While those interpretations have gone apart, it was written by the military, and by the way, very quickly. So the urgency of the moment also brought as well militaries to put on the table a text that will be adaptable to conflicts as they will evolve. So there are no quotas in there, but that doesn't give a way for unlimited interpretation of the casualty. And that comes back to the moral element as well, is when is that red line being crossed? When are we saying this is not fit into the space for interpretation? But militaries have led through the Geneva Convention to actually allow it as well to be valid decades after. 2 points on our end. The first one, and my president keeps repeating it, IHL needs to be a political priority and an operational reality. It's not just enough to say and to hear it here in New York in every statement that IHL is important. We hear that every day, every state says it. Now it's important to see that reality on the ground. And we can unfortunately see that there's a lot of room here to work. The other element is the non-reciprocity. We see too often parties agreeing to improving based on the behavior of the enemy. And this is just not acceptable. That's another element that needs to be called out. We should not have to accept that a party will improve its behavior if the other ones start changing. That doesn't go this way. Of course, if both parties commit, the situation will improve, the protection of the civilians will be better. But we can't just let that loop going on and hence justify trends that need to be stopped because it's uncompliant with IHL. So I think there's an importance here to really make sure that that work needs to start from every parties first and foremost, and obviously will have the couple effect if all the parties do the same work.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, 2 points, which is very interesting discussion. So first of all, on the political will and the global scene, there is a strong trend today of double discourse. I mean, let's face it. We have the majority of the states in the world and the populations, which is very important, that don't believe a word that what the West is saying. So basically, I talk about the sanctions, for example, which is a way of accountability. I mean, it's great. You did something wrong. There is international, let's say, understanding that we will sanction you at individual level or at global level. But we see that it does not work both ways. It works for certain countries, from some countries, but when you have similar situations, then suddenly the system is not really working or moving. And this, what it creates a lack of credibility. People don't believe anymore in the international community because we know what means this international community. We know which states are belonging to this international community. So of course, it creates gaps. And when you have gap, then you can't have implementation. So for me, first and foremost, we need to strengthen the credibility level by making sure that we have, let's say, inclusive way of applying sanctions in an equal way without, political, let's say, thinking, or I choose this state and not this state. As an example, of course, I see today with the ICC decision, I mean, from the prosecutor, it's going in the right direction. It will open the debate for maybe some other countries that, okay, it's not really only one-sided. And I worked at the ICC before, and we had a similar reaction, that why these states and not these states? So I think now we need a bit of balance. Secondly, the political will needs to be strengthened at the local level as well. We need to include communities in the decision-making. They need to have a say as well in how these frameworks are being implemented. I think it's important that we have as well this level of communities being as well, let's say, involved in the type of actions that we want to do with them. On the distinction, civilians and armed actors, the problem, it's harder to distinguish civilian and armed actor in an urban warfare. This is why in history, wars were waged outside of cities. In the Greek times, in Roman times, in the Middle Age even, which is one of the most violent ages of humanity, you fight outside of cities. But nowadays, it's okay. Let's wage wars, and you talk about urban warfare. We should not have urban warfare. Cities have nothing to do with wars. So it's really hard to have a distinction, but we should make sure that it is clearly, let's say, understood by parties to conflict, whoever they are, that a civilian remains a civilian, even if he's trapped in a setting where you have combatants. I think this is extremely important. And the last point, it's an anecdotal maybe, but it's true now, the military, they see IHL differently than humanitarians, and it's interesting because they talk about law of armed conflict, while we speak about international humanitarian law, like this humanity meaning. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. But I believe on the ground, humanitarians actually have the same language as the army or military. We are practical and we are pragmatic. It's about reconciling the both worlds, the Geneva and the New York and the field. So once again, I go back to the notion of inclusivity. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
I just have two quick points. The words equality and accountability. The charters say all states are equal, but there's no equality, there's no equity. I raised it earlier, and I think others did too. As long as there's no equality, I mean, we're hoping, Adam, I think your point is how do we get out of this? Because there's a lot of somberness and soberness in all the statistics and conversations that we're having right now. There has to be equality. When I was speaking to the Houthis, the Taliban, government officials, wherever, they see it as some states are excused and others are not. It is fundamental that literally all states are equal, all colors are equal, all people are equal, and it's not the case. If we don't get that right, and it's our job and our duty as UN and academia and NGOs and ICRC and all of us to continue to remind ourselves of the importance of equality, equality, equity, and all of that, because that for me is fundamental. The second one is accountability. In the 90s, we saw what happened in Srebrenica and all of that, and seeing that that people were held to account. One day I dream that what is happening today, what happened in Ukraine, what happened in Sudan, the people will be held to account in a way that will give the populations that we all serve some hope. Because right now, without that accountability, with complete pervasive impunity, it just happens. You just get blasted and nothing happens. The world is watching. If we don't mix the two together, accountability and equity, it's game over. And I think we need to challenge ourselves. Every time we're briefing the council, we need to be sure that we are balanced in our disposition, balanced in the story that we're telling, balanced in what we're seeing. But there is a hypocrisy, that we need to also be clear about. Without equality, without accountability, really, there is no hope. But there is hope because we can and will continue to push these two drivers. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. No, and I think that the Summit of the Future was mentioned, and IPI has been tracking multiple processes, and this question of equality, equity is coming up in all debates, all files across the system. It is clearly a driving discourse right now that needs to be addressed if we are going to have that future that we're looking to have. Wonderful. A lot on the table, a lot to discuss. The floor is open. We've got about 25 minutes before we need to turn to Her Excellency, Pascal Barasuel. Please, floor is open. If you have a comment, a question, please tell us your name and affiliation. I've got one here in the front and then one in the back. Biotech, and you're standing right at the back, ready to go? Okay, we'll go with the one in the back first and then come up here in the front. Okay.
It seems to me very important that you extend discussion, not limit only to situation in Gaza. I want to extend discussion a little bit more. If this discussion happened 8 years ago, and at this time when cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and many others were practically eliminated by bombing, and there was no military there. And I would mention here again Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no civilians. And after the war, 14 million German was displaced and forever sent from their land and never demand, and nobody protects them to come back. If the situation would be extended to analysis of American war of terror, when almost 1 million people were killed, civilians, $7 trillion spent in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and all around. It would be same approach or different approach. Same judgment, not different judgment. And even not only in this particularly controversial cases, in Africa.
Clear, I don't think the conversation has been specifically focused on Gaza at all. Multiple other cases have been mentioned. So
in other cases,
yes. So, I mean, we're in agreement. This is not a conversation specifically about Gaza, but about the trend in IHL that we're seeing over the last 20 years. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, here up front. Yeah. What was the question?
Thanks so much. This has been a fascinating panel discussion so far. Andrew Carswell from Global Affairs Canada. My question is mostly directed at Naz because she's the IHL lawyer, but really it's to everyone. And the question is about gross casualty figures. So who are the civilians that we're protecting? We often hear about X number of people have been killed in such conflict or X number of casualties and disabled by the conflict, but we don't often hear about where the dividing line is between civilian and combatant. Legally, that can be fairly simple. Civilians are everybody who's not a member of the fighting forces. But we know that it's also quite complex and gets into some contentious areas of interpretation about direct participation in hostilities and how do you determine membership in a non-state armed group. But if you take that complexity and just allow it to cloud the vision, eventually everybody starts to look like a member of the fighting forces and there are fewer and fewer civilians to protect. So some thoughts on that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
Right, I can to the back there, to your left, back there. Back, hands up. There.
Hi, so I'm actually an aspiring IHL lawyer and
Mind standing up so we can
Oh,
see you?
yes.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm 24 actually, so I'm pretty young. And, you know, as an aspiring IHL lawyer, I would say, how are member states, you know, finding that balance between a moral compass and, you know, military tactic? Like, as a young professional, I feel like I've lost hope. And as the panel has stated, you know, there doesn't seem to be any compassion or humanity in the world anymore. So how are we going to move forward and create a world where everyone is, you know, safe, not just the wealthy or the rich, but everyone?
Excellent, thank you. Take one more before we go back here. Yeah, here.
Thank you very much. My name is Sunil Pal. I'm with the International Development Law Organization. The panelists already touched upon this, but I'm hoping they could say a little bit more about the damage that selectivity does to international humanitarian law and the damage to the rule of law more generally. And we see it to some extent play out in states' responses to Gaza versus Ukraine, whether it's political pronouncements or even supporting the legal proceedings before the ICJ. And we've seen the damage to some extent to the ICC. What remains to be seen, given the events of today, how that will necessarily play out. But for those of us, for advocates, for practitioners, for supporters of international law, or even aspiring young lawyers, how do we respond to that? How do we respond to that challenge?
Excellent, thank you. We'll come back to the panel, and then maybe we'll have round for one more round, and then we'll turn to closing remarks. So we've got questions around the distinction between civilians and combatants, damage to selectivity, and the lost hope of our youth. Well, hold up one second. We're going to come back to you after.
I can start. I can jump in. I was 24 when I joined the UN, and I still am fundamentally clear on this journey. The world would be much worse without the Security Council resolutions, without a lot of things that are happening. So please don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. It's what we're talking about here, some of the realities, but we can continue to fight. And to the gentleman at the end here on the, the selectivity. We need to call things as they are. We cannot be seen to take sides. I think fundamentally, speak truth to power. There's a lot of, I think Leticia talked about it, disinformation, misinformation. We need to continue putting the statistics out there. The AI in our world today is a crazy, scary thing, but we have to constantly speak truth no matter what. And I think that will help. For the advocacy, we can't take sides. We shouldn't take sides. And sometimes it's seen as a Western agenda or whatever. We have to continue that. And I'm really hopeful that with our collective minds from academia throughout all these, the different entities that exist, we can continue to do the best we can. We cannot leave a generation hopeless, without hope. We need to constantly, and I think it's our responsibility and our duty to speak the truth. And I think, and I stress that because there's a lot of negativity out there. There's a lot of untruths out there, to be honest. And there's a lot of pressure on the UN Secretariat, the UN agencies, funds, and programs to take sides and not to always say what it is. We risk our lives every day, every single day in really hard environments so that we call it protection by presence. So that we're living with the people in need, we're living with them to tell their story. Everywhere we go, you know, we're in pretty dangerous place. We have teams in Gaza, we have teams in different parts of Ukraine. I have a team in Kharkiv, just, you know, who run into the bunker every time there's shelling. We have teams in Kandahar. We have teams everywhere where, you know, in Port Sudan, in Darfur, we have teams who continue to bear witness to the truths out there. The day we lose that, it's over, but we will not lose that. Please don't lose faith. It's yeah, we can have a conversation after.
I think that's a really important reminder, and Nas meant this in her conversations with many of the military. Often, it's the humanitarians that have more field experience in these contexts. You know, I realize that the gentleman here is holding the microphone, and I didn't let him go. So maybe actually, given time, maybe I'll do this one last question, and then we'll continue on up here. So please, sir, yes.
Yeah, thank you to Group Captain Ekchawan Manawong from Thailand military advisor. I was in Darfur too about 10 years ago, and every morning that I was in the briefing room, I was very sad. I almost lose hope too, but I just hope that at the time there was somebody else doing a great job to protect, to continue protection of civilians. But I was in the military side, so I couldn't do anything much except abide by the UN rule and regulation whatsoever then. So, but my question is nothing related to Darfur, but just a little point of view from military officer. Of course, the military officer, the member state, I'm sure that they intend to protect civilian in all times, but in some contexts, the combatants or the bad guys, they use the benefit of protection of civilians, come under the cover of civilian and attack or target the military. So in my view, there should be some address about protection of military in certain circumstances. So they would have more information, or they would feel more protected, and then they could perform better to protect civilian. Otherwise, they were not sure whether that, you know, when they say a civilian, they are not sure is true civilian or not, or some combatant or bad guy under cover of civilian using having a benefit of, you know, civilian to attack that military. So in ICRC or any legal venue could address this point, if those kind of action could be considered illegal and then they shouldn't be protected. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have on the table questions of selectivity and distinction between civilians and combatants. If Letitia or Hisham, you want to
And
get
Andrew's question as well.
Yeah. Sure.
Sure. You want me to go?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I think I'll take, hi, Andrew. I'll take your question, and I think it connects actually to the last comment. So without becoming technical or legalistic, this fundamental question of what happens when it is actually not clear who is a civilian and who's a combatant, right? Not sort of misinformation, not manipulation, but in fact, in reality, it is very difficult to tell, which more and more is the situation on the ground. And how do we sort of decide who is on either side? And perhaps more importantly, who decides who is in one category and the other? So I think there is the kind of the tactical question of what happens on the actual battlefield when there is a lack of clarity. And, you know, we won't recite the law here, but the idea is that when in doubt, we assume civilian, right? That is the fundamental rule that animates IHL and that animates the rules. But that does not mean that there is no effect on the military, right? The more we turn the dial towards civilian protection, of course, the more that means that those soldiers that are on the front line against an adversary that is using civilian protection in order to gain advantage, they are more vulnerable to those attacks, right? And that is, I think that is why we have to be not just inclusive, but also candid about what the costs and benefits are of different approaches to IHL. On the question of direct participation in hostilities and the counting of casualties and the idea of how do we know how many people have died that are civilian and how do we know how many people have died that are fighters, obviously extremely contentious right now in a number of conflicts. I think my sense is that this is an excellent example of the kind of IHL issue that has not been made political and has not been made into a broader debate amongst ministries of foreign affairs, humanitarians, other actors who are involved in how states make decisions and whether or not we agree on the right rules. So at the risk of avoiding answering the questions substantively, I think the answer to the question of how do we decide what it means to be directly participating in hostilities is that we need to be having that conversation in a way that activates our broader responsibility to one another, that this cannot be a military-only decision or even debate, and that it needs to be more accessible and comprehensible to more actors who have actual responsibility for the decisions that states make, including on the battlefield. Just a question on the selectivity. So a very brief anecdote, and then I'll stop. I had the opportunity to participate in a side event with mostly colleagues from Western member states talking about Ukraine and the International Court of Justice. And I raised the issue of double standards, very diplomatically, very appropriately, as an academic should. And colleagues were horrified. I mean, it was as though I had said something completely inappropriate, insulting even. And I had text messages from colleagues, diplomats in the room saying, I've never seen someone attacked this way in a sort of otherwise very sort of legalistic side event. So here is my advice, if I may, because I heard you to be asking, name it, say it. When you think you see selectivity, when you think you see a situation where member states and leaders sense and feel not just that there is not equality, but that they are being spoken down to, that they are being lectured, call it out, right? Say, I'm from an independent NGO, and we believe that selectivity is playing a role here, and we believe that it is acceptable to acknowledge that and then try together to do something to create a better and more productive way of having these conversations. But I think right now there's something really powerful about just hearing and acknowledging that there are diplomats, leaders, and member states that have sensed for quite a long time that not only there isn't meaningful equity, but also that the law is not being applied the same way to all actors.
Excellent, thank you. It's such a rich discussion. Did either one jump in?
No, please go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So now these are great questions, and I would like to as well give a feedback to the gentleman at the back, because he raised an important point. And I saw on Twitter a lot of comments about the civilians killed in Gaza, for example, but Dresden, the allies, did the same thing and 10 times worse, and nothing happened to them. And Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which is like beyond what is insane, but all this happened before a certain date, before 1949, which led to the creation of the Geneva Conventions. I think for me, it's extremely good. We saw all these disasters, and then the states said, okay, guys, I think we went a bit too far. Let's sit together and create some text that will limit ourselves. So I think it's very important. It happened, and then we had the creation of Geneva Conventions. So I hope that we won't have to reach another Dresden, another Hiroshima before changing, having a new set. I think it's important to have this in mind. When it comes to the notion of selectivity, it's making me a bit think about the rest of the world, like the peacetime, when we had like women that were, in difficulty in companies, the diversity and inclusion. And when we had to call out, when I saw act of racism, act of discrimination, we called out at an individual level. I think we should be the same. I think I agree with you. And maybe having a kind of a global movement, like the Me Too movement, but for the states that are using selectivity, because it's the same thing. Why they favor this person and not this person? It's the same thing. People feel injustice. They feel it's not fair. And when you have this feeling within you, it's too late. You can't even hear any arguments, because whatever you hear, you say, no, you are not, doesn't apply to you. So I think we have to fight back against this selectivity by what you say, calling out, and reminding ourselves that whatever we do and balance our way, we have this reciprocity back. States will start to speak to each other. But today there is no dialogue because everyone feels that everyone speaks for their own side. There is really this divide. And on the last point I wanted to raise is about this military and civilians. It's true, on the ground, it's extremely difficult for militaries. And sir, I'm sure you applied perfectly the rules and what you learned, but when you are fighting on the ground and you have civilians mixed between combatants without even wearing distinctive uniforms, then what do you do? And we are asked the questions, militarians, to give us an idea. And I think this is extremely important. So we have to speak to civilians to remind them their sense of responsibility. They lose their protective status as civilians as long as they're not act as civilians anymore. So I think it's extremely important that we talk about as well responsibility around the civilian community and reminding as well combatants that are not, openly wearing arms or wearing distinctive signs that if they do that, they will put in danger their own communities. I think it's really important that we come back to the basics. Let's go back a bit to history, how wars were waged before. And I think we can put back a bit of, let's say, morality and rationality in the way we wage war. Today, it's not rational anymore. It's just, I have whatever weapons I have, and I throw it anywhere I want, and I see the results. So I think we have to fight that by continuing the trainings, as you had, sir. I think we should continue that at every level, talking to civilians and communities about as well their responsibilities. They are not just recipients of aid, they are actors of their own change. So they have a sense of responsibility. And as well talking to the armed groups, to the illegal combatants, as the military sometimes say, by telling them, look guys, if you are not, dressed as a combatant, then these are the consequences against your own population. Thank you. So,
yeah, I also wanted to bring some element to the gentleman at the beginning who asked the question. And complemented to what Hisham said, yes, we have a past we've been building upon and learning from the hard way. We also see a little bit of a looming reality ahead of us. We talk about large-scale operations, all those drills about large warfare, where we know compliance with ICHL will just not be possible. There's no way, and not just talking about the nuclear taboo that has fallen in the last 2 years, there's no way that those large-scale, between big powers or in regions will be anyway compliant with ICHL. We've been saying it. So it's also at some stage, what can we avoid facing in the future, seeing how the world is also dealing with conflicts that are sometimes much more smaller in scale, but equally, worryingly very impactful as well in terms of suffering and the price for civilians. So I think it's a very important question. We need to look ahead. The plan that militaries are working on are really scary. We really are concerned about how far this can go. And ICHL is probably what remains the key normative framework to look into and to make sure that those are also taken into consideration as those plans move ahead. The selectivity of law, I think my colleagues already answered, but just wanted to say that the erosion is palatable. It's really impactful in the sense that sometimes ICHL has become a hashtag, oh yeah, I'm going to put ICHL in my statement 5 times. That sounds good, saying the right words, but as long as it's just theoretical, it will have an impact of what do we consider being essential into ICHL. And I think it's important that we see those elements coming into the fact that war cannot be at all costs. And this is really the reality we're fighting today. Don't let humanitarians be the only ones saying it. I think it's important that everyone says it, and that is brought into the Security Council and those that can decide as well that at some stage, efforts need to be put on de-escalation, to compliant mechanisms, and to solve long-term issues that need to be solved before it gets too late. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. There's been such a rich conversation. There's so much more to follow up on, so much more discussions to be had. You just mentioned the Security Council, which is a wonderful segue to our closing remarks, where I will leave it the difficult task of closing here to Her Excellency Pascal Bayerswell, Permanent Representative of Switzerland for the United Nations, who's here instead of at the Security Council, which is just really, we're really grateful to have you. Pascal, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Wow, what a powerful panel. And I would like to say what a powerful panel to start the POC week with. And I would also say civilians are not a target. It may sound nearly cynical, but it's true. And we have to remind ourselves of that all the time. So today's panel discussion was actually aimed to assess the last 25 years and identify challenges and opportunities for the Security Council to further enhance protection of civilians. But this discussion was much richer and went far beyond. So that may mean two things. Maybe it may show that the Security Council has lost some relevance, so that you went far beyond, but also that the Security Council is just one element when it is about protecting civilians. It's also about protecting civilians where wars happen, and the Security Council may be just one element here. Let me still bring it back there. And while we commemorate the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1265, I think everyone acknowledges that it was a pivotal moment that elevated the status of POC as a crucial element of international peace and security. I think many said it has been saving lives. If it was not there, we would be in a worse place, but we also all realize that there is much more to do, and that at the moment we are in a situation where protection of civilians is simply not good enough. And I may come from this kind of Geneva community, but I think it's very important, as Nas put it, but I think it's very important that there is not one community there. We are all in the same boat. And it's very important to remember that the efficacy of international humanitarian law hinges on the commitment of states and armed groups. That's where the responsibility lies and where it has to lie. We can also say that over the years, armed conflicts have undergone significant transformations long before this crisis has become so strong. And we are witnessing countless international law violations causing death, destruction, desolation, and growing humanitarian needs. And I think it's always important that we never forget, when we speak about those figures, that we speak about actual human beings, lost their lives, lost their families, had to flee. So we have a very dynamic, if we want to put it positively, landscape. It has generated new challenges. We have not even spoken about artificial intelligence and some of the other challenges still ahead. And we have to make sure that humanitarian organizations can reach those in need. It has also necessitated the continuous adaptation of peace operations, which, while still focused on protecting civilian lives, have also taken on the tasks of demobilizing child soldiers and empowering, protecting women and girls, ever more growing tasks. But there again, I think we heard from the panel that if there had not been those peace operations there, more people would have died. So they have protected people. Even so, the task is very challenging. Protecting civilians from the effects of war has never been easy, and it is always important when we think of what we now consider the golden ages of the 90s and 2000. We still had genocides, two heavy genocides during those years. So maybe there have never been those golden years. We are now thinking back that they were there. It has never been easy, and in many ways it's becoming more and more complex and demanding. Humanitarian actors, and we have heard that, face numerous obstacles in providing protection and assistance to people in need, including restricted access, insecurity, and attacks on their staff, which has massively increased, not only in Gaza, but in many conflict contexts. This is also why my country has put forward the Security Council resolution aiming at improving the safety and security of aid workers and UN personnel, in particular local and national staff. And of course, it's very challenging to bring such a resolution at the moment into the Council because the common denominator is very low. But I think it's very important that we manage that. And this resolution, we hope that later this week we can open it for co-sponsoring. That's also why I would encourage all colleagues from other countries here to co-sponsor that resolution and help us make a political statement and give it political momentum. The responsibility to protect civilians, and I think that can never be repeated enough, falls first and foremost to the parties to a conflict, but also third states in view of their obligation to ensure and respect for IHL. It's imperative that all states go beyond mere verbal support for POC, we have also heard that, and take concrete steps to implement it, thereby abiding by their own legal obligations. For Switzerland, strengthening the protection of civilians in armed conflict is one of our main priorities for the term at the Security Council. It's something we try on a daily basis in every resolution, and I can tell you it's very hard work. The POC agenda is the political reflection of IHL rules designed to protect civilians, further reinforced by international human rights and refugee law. And for this year's 75th anniversary of the Geneva Convention, my country is organizing a commemoration in August in Geneva. We really want to strengthen the political momentum, have more discussions like this, and really give responsibilities back where they should be. It's high time to uphold the continued relevance of these conventions and call for their political reappropriation to guarantee the effectiveness of IHL in the future. Universally ratified, the conventions represent a unique commitment in the name of our common humanity. And I would like to stop here and thank so much the fantastic panelists and also Adam as a moderator of that very powerful ladies and the gentlemen. I think I could stop with what Adam said while saying also there is a poet I always think of perfect as there is no perfect life in an imperfect world. I think it's important. But still, and there I would be with Adam saying, our obligation is to at least try and try harder to speak the truth no matter what. So that's what I wanted to end with. Thank you very, very much, and have a very relevant POC week and help us make POC more relevant also in the Security Council. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you.